Have you ever stopped for a moment and asked yourself, why do I love the way I love? Not just who you love, not just who broke you, not just who stayed or left, but something deeper than all of that. Why does your heart always seem to react the same way, no matter the person in front of you? Why do you fall too hard or hold back too much or feel too much, even when you promised yourself you wouldn't? Most people never ask this question. They spend years blaming the wrong things. They blame timing, they blame people, they blame luck. But very few look inward and realize something powerful. The way you love is not random. It has a pattern, a rhythm, a hidden logic that has been running silently in the background of your emotional life for years. And once you start noticing it, you can't unsee it. Think about it. You might meet someone new and everything feels exciting at first, but somehow the same emotional cycle begins again, the same overthinking, the same fear, the same emotional distance, or maybe the same deep attachment that feels like it's stronger than your control. It almost feels like your heart is repeating a script you didn't write, but you are still acting it out. This is where most people feel confused. They think they just have bad luck in love or always attract the wrong people. But psychology points towards something much deeper. It suggests that your emotional reactions are not just reactions to people. They are patterns built over time. Patterns shaped quietly, often without your awareness, from the very beginning of your emotional life. And here is where it becomes even more interesting. Because if your way of loving is a pattern, then it is not an accident. It is learned. It is conditioned. And anything that is learned can be understood. But before we go deeper into that, there is something important you need to realize. The biggest emotional struggles in relationships are not always about love itself. They are about fear. Fear of losing, fear of not being enough, fear of getting too close, fear of being left behind, fear of trusting and being hurt again. And fear is powerful. It doesn't shout. It doesn't announce itself. It quietly shapes your decisions. It decides how fast you trust, how deeply you attach, how quickly you withdraw. And sometimes, it even decides who you choose in the first place. That is why two people can experience the same situation, but feel completely different emotional realities inside it. One feels safe. The other feels anxious. One feels free. The other feels trapped. The difference is not just the relationship. The difference is the internal emotional blueprint each person carries, and most people never realize they are carrying one. So when you ask yourself, why do I love the way that I love? You are not just asking a simple emotional question. You are stepping into something much bigger. You are beginning to question your emotional programming, the invisible system that decides how your heart responds before your mind even has time to think. And here is the truth that can feel uncomfortable at first, but also freeing. You did not choose your first emotional responses. You did not choose how safe or unsafe love felt when you were first learning what connection meant. You simply adapted. Your mind and heart learned patterns to survive emotionally, to protect you, to help you navigate connection in the way it understood at the time. But what once helped you survive emotionally may now be shaping your relationships in ways you never intended. This is why some people love deeply, but fear losing control of that love. This is why some people pull away the moment things get too close. This is why some people feel like they are always chasing emotional reassurance. And this is why some people feel like they are constantly walking on emotional eggshells in relationships. It is not because they are broken. It is because their emotional system learned a specific way to respond to love. And once you understand that, something powerful happens inside you. You stop seeing love as random chaos. You start seeing it as a pattern that can be understood. And anything that can be understood can also be transformed. But here is where most people make a mistake. They think awareness alone is enough. They think once they realize their patterns, everything will instantly change. But awareness is only the beginning. It is the doorway, not the destination. The real shift happens when you start to see the different ways humans are wired to love, the different emotional patterns that shape how people connect, react, and protect themselves in relationships. Because once you recognize these patterns, you start to understand not just yourself, but everyone around you. And that understanding changes everything. So as we go deeper into this, keep one thing in mind. This is not about labeling yourself. It is not about putting your emotions into a box. It is about seeing clearly for the first time how your emotional world has been shaped, and realizing that what was once unconscious can now become conscious. And when something becomes conscious, it stops controlling you in the dark. Stay with this, because what comes next will help you finally understand the hidden emotional patterns that have been influencing your relationships all along, and why you love the way you love in the first place. What if everything you believed about love being random was never true? People grow up thinking relationships are unpredictable. They believe connection happens by chance, like two lives colliding without logic. One moment someone appears, emotions rise, and suddenly life changes direction. It feels mysterious, almost uncontrollable. But psychology tells a different story beneath that surface experience. Love may feel spontaneous, but the way you respond to it is built on structure. Not visible structure, not something you can easily notice in daily life, but a deep internal system that organizes how you interpret closeness, distance, attention, and emotional safety. Every human mind is shaped by repetition. From childhood onward, the brain begins to connect emotional experiences with meaning. When something is felt again and again in a similar way, it becomes familiar. And familiarity is powerful. It creates comfort even when the experience is not truly healthy or balanced. The mind often chooses what it recognizes over what is actually good for it. This is why love can feel like a pattern rather than a surprise. When someone experiences care, attention, or emotional distance early in life, the brain does not just store those moments as memories, it stores them as instructions. Silent instructions about what connection feels like, what to expect from others, and how to behave when emotions rise. Over time, these instructions turn into automatic reactions. Without conscious effort, the mind begins to predict emotional outcomes before they even happen. A small change in tone, a delayed reply, a sudden increase in attention, or even silence can trigger deep internal responses that feel immediate and strong. This is not imagination. This is conditioning. The human brain is designed to learn through association. If emotional closeness once came with uncertainty, the nervous system remembers that connection can carry tension. If attention once came unpredictably, the mind becomes alert when attention increases or decreases. If affection once felt overwhelming or inconsistent, the body learns to stay guarded even in safe situations. So later in life, when love appears again, it is not experienced as something entirely new. It is filtered through old emotional data. That is why different people can stand in the same relationship and feel completely different internal realities. One feels calm and connected. Another feels restless and unsure. The situation is the same, but the internal interpretation is not. This is also where emotional repetition begins to make sense. Many people notice they attract similar relationship dynamics, even with completely different partners. Different faces, different personalities, but somehow the emotional experience feels strangely familiar. The same intensity, the same confusion, the same longing, or the same emotional distance keeps reappearing. This happens because the mind is not only searching for love, it is searching for what it understands as love. Even when that understanding creates discomfort, it still feels recognizable, and the brain often prefers recognition over uncertainty. This is why someone might feel unusually drawn to emotional intensity even when they know it leads to stress, or why calm and stable connection might feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable at first. The nervous system does not immediately trust what it has not practiced. Dopamine also plays a role in this cycle. The brain releases it not just when something feels good, but when something feels unpredictable. Uncertainty creates anticipation. Anticipation creates emotional focus. That focus can feel like attraction, even when it is actually the brain reacting to inconsistency. This is why certain relationships feel addictive, not because they are healthy, but because they activate a cycle of emotional highs and lows that keeps the mind engaged. The system becomes used to chasing clarity, reassurance, or emotional stability within the same connection. Over time, this creates a loop. A person experiences a specific emotional pattern. The brain stores it. Later, it seeks similar emotional signals again, not because it wants pain or confusion, but because it recognizes that pattern as known territory. Even when someone consciously wants something different, the deeper system still reacts in familiar ways. This is where confusion often begins in adulthood. People believe they are making new choices, yet they keep stepping into similar emotional experiences. They assume it is coincidence, or bad luck, or simply the wrong people. But underneath that belief, something more structured is happening. The internal emotional system is guiding attention toward what feels familiar, not necessarily what feels aligned. And familiarity is powerful enough to override logic in moments of emotional intensity. This is why understanding love requires more than just surface-level thinking. It requires recognizing that emotional responses are not random reactions happening in isolation. They are built from accumulated experiences that shaped how safety, attention, and connection are interpreted. When this becomes clear, a shift begins to form. The idea that love is purely chance starts to weaken. Instead, it becomes easier to see that there is an internal blueprint quietly influencing emotional choices. A blueprint formed over time, through repetition, experience, and adaptation. And once this realization settles in, the question changes. It is no longer just about who is being loved or why relationships unfold a certain way. It becomes about understanding the origin of those emotional instructions. Because if love follows a structure, then that structure can be studied. And if it can be studied, it can eventually be reshaped. But before that becomes possible, there is another layer that must be understood. Not just how patterns form, but the specific emotional styles that people develop from these patterns, and why each person experiences connection in such different ways, even when they long for the same thing at the core. That is where the deeper psychology of attachment begins to reveal itself, and where everything starts to make even more sense. If there is an internal system guiding how connection is experienced, then the next question becomes clear. What exactly is shaping that system? Every person carries something invisible into every relationship. It cannot be seen, but it can be felt in reactions, decisions, and emotional shifts. It is like a silent guide that influences how trust is built, how closeness is handled, and how fear appears when something feels uncertain. This invisible guide is often formed long before anyone understands what love even means. In early life, the mind begins to observe how connection works, not through logic, not through explanation, but through experience. A child does not analyze behavior. A child feels it. Every moment of attention, every moment of absence, every response, every delay, every expression of care or distance leaves an imprint. Those imprints do not fade away. They organize themselves into patterns. Over time, these patterns become expectations. Quiet expectations about how others will behave, about whether closeness feels safe or unstable, about whether expressing emotions leads to comfort or discomfort. These expectations become the foundation of how relationships are experienced later in life. This foundation is often called an emotional blueprint. It is not something chosen consciously. It develops naturally, based on repeated interactions. The brain is always learning, always adapting, always trying to make sense of the environment. When certain emotional experiences happen again and again, the brain builds a model to predict what will happen next. Prediction creates a sense of control. Even when the prediction is not positive, the mind prefers knowing what might happen over stepping into something completely unknown. This is why people often feel drawn toward familiar emotional experiences, even when those experiences create tension or confusion. The blueprint does not ask whether something is healthy. It asks whether something is recognized. Inside this blueprint, there are key elements that shape how connection is approached. One of them is trust. Not just trust in others, but trust in the idea that connection will remain stable over time. Another element is self-worth, the internal belief about whether one deserves consistent care and attention. And another is emotional regulation, which influences how the mind responds when feelings become intense. These elements work together quietly. For example, when someone receives attention, their blueprint determines how that attention is interpreted. One person may feel calm and open, another may feel overwhelmed. Someone else may feel suspicious or unsure. The external situation is the same, but the internal reaction is completely different. This is not a coincidence. It is a result of conditioning. The blueprint also affects how distance is experienced. A small gap in communication may feel normal to one person, while to another it may trigger deep concern. Silence may feel peaceful to one, but uncomfortable to another. These reactions are not random emotional swings. They are responses shaped by past experiences that taught the brain what certain signals mean. And once these meanings are formed, they tend to repeat. This repetition creates a sense of identity. People begin to believe that this is just how I am. They label themselves based on their emotional responses. They might think they are too sensitive, too distant, too intense, or too detached. But those labels do not explain the origin of those behaviors. They only describe the outcome. The truth is, these reactions were learned over time. They were developed as ways to navigate connection in an environment that required adaptation. The mind created strategies to handle emotional situations based on what it experienced repeatedly. Some of these strategies focus on staying close to maintain connection. Others focus on creating distance to avoid discomfort. Some shift between both, depending on the situation, but all of them are rooted in the same place. The early emotional blueprint. This blueprint becomes active whenever a relationship begins. It influences how quickly someone opens up. It shapes how they respond to attention. It determines how they handle conflict, silence, affection, or uncertainty. It operates quietly, often without conscious awareness, guiding reactions in real time. And because it works automatically, it can feel like these reactions are simply part of personality. But personality is not fixed. It is shaped. And anything shaped can be reshaped. Understanding this changes everything. It removes the idea that emotional patterns are permanent traits. Instead, it reveals that they are adaptive responses built over time. Once that becomes clear, it becomes possible to step back and observe those patterns instead of being controlled by them. Observation creates distance. Distance creates awareness. And awareness creates the possibility for change. This is where deeper understanding begins to form. When the emotional blueprint becomes visible, it becomes easier to see that different people operate with different internal systems. Each person carries their own version of connection, trust, and emotional response. This is why relationships can feel effortless for some and complicated for others. It is not about one person being right and another being wrong. It is about different internal models interacting with each other. And when these models do not align, confusion appears. One person may seek closeness while the other creates space. One may need reassurance while the other values independence. One may interpret silence as calm, while another experiences it as distance. These differences are not flaws. They are reflections of different emotional blueprints shaped by different experiences. This is where a deeper level of clarity starts to emerge. Because once it becomes clear that these patterns exist, the next step is to understand the specific ways they show up, not just as general ideas, but as distinct styles of connection that people develop over time. These styles explain why emotional reactions differ so much from one person to another. They explain why some relationships feel balanced while others feel intense or distant. They reveal the structure behind what once felt unpredictable. And once these styles are understood, everything begins to make even more sense. So now the picture becomes clearer. There is a hidden structure, there is a personal blueprint, and there are repeated emotional reactions that follow it. But the most important step is still ahead. Understanding how this entire system is explained in psychology, because once you see the full framework, everything begins to connect. There is a concept that explains how human beings form bonds, how they react to closeness, and how they handle emotional connection throughout life. It is not a theory built on guesses. It comes from years of observing human behavior, emotional responses, and relationship patterns across different environments. Attachment theory reveals something powerful. It shows that the way people connect with others is shaped early, and those patterns continue into adulthood unless they are consciously changed. This idea may sound simple at first, but its impact is deep. It explains why two individuals can walk into a relationship with completely different expectations without even realizing it. It explains why one person may feel secure while the other feels uncertain, even when both care about each other. It shows that love is not only about feelings, it is about how those feelings are processed internally. At its core, this concept focuses on how early emotional experiences shape future connection. When a child interacts with caregivers, the brain begins to learn what closeness feels like. It observes whether support is consistent or unpredictable. It senses whether emotional needs are met with warmth or distance. These experiences create a foundation that later becomes the basis for adult relationships. But this is not about remembering specific moments. It is about how those moments were felt. The brain stores emotional patterns more deeply than it stores events. It learns the emotional tone of interactions. It learns whether connection feels calming or stressful. It learns whether expressing needs leads to comfort or discomfort. These emotional lessons become automatic responses in future relationships. This is why people often react without thinking. A simple situation can trigger a strong emotional response that seems out of proportion. A delayed message can create worry. A sudden increase in attention can feel overwhelming. A moment of silence can feel heavy. These reactions are not random. They are rooted in earlier experiences that taught the mind what certain signals mean. And because these responses happen quickly, they feel natural. People often assume their reactions are based only on the present moment. But in reality, the past is influencing the present quietly. The emotional system is connecting current experiences with stored patterns, creating reactions that feel immediate and real. This is where understanding begins to shift perspective. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" the question becomes, "What pattern is being activated right now?" That small change in thinking creates awareness, and awareness opens the door to change. This framework also explains why relationships can feel so intense. When emotional patterns are triggered, the brain responds as if something important is at stake. It may not be a physical threat, but the emotional system reacts strongly because connection is deeply tied to safety. Humans are wired to seek connection, and any signal that affects that connection can feel significant. This is why love can feel powerful, sometimes overwhelming. It is not just about the present interaction. It is about deeper emotional systems being activated, systems that were built over time, shaped by repeated experiences, and reinforced through familiarity. Another important part of this concept is that these patterns are not fixed. Even though they are formed early, they can change. The brain remains adaptable. It continues to learn through new experiences. When someone begins to understand their patterns, they can start responding differently. And when responses change, the brain begins to update its expectations. This process takes time, but it is possible. It starts with recognizing that emotional reactions are not permanent traits. They are learned responses, and learned responses can be reshaped through awareness and new experiences. This understanding removes a lot of confusion. Instead of feeling trapped in repeating cycles, it becomes clear that those cycles have a structure. And once a structure is visible, it can be adjusted. It is no longer something mysterious or uncontrollable. It becomes something that can be worked with. This is where empowerment begins. When people realize that their emotional patterns have an explanation, they stop blaming themselves or others completely. They begin to see that there is a system behind their reactions, a system that was built for adaptation, not perfection. And this creates a sense of clarity, because now, instead of seeing love as unpredictable chaos, it becomes something that follows certain patterns that can be understood, observed, and gradually changed. But this is only the beginning of the deeper understanding, because within this framework, there are specific styles that people develop. These styles describe how individuals approach connection, how they handle closeness, and how they respond to emotional situations. Each style represents a different way of experiencing relationships. Some people feel comfortable with closeness and trust. Others feel anxious and uncertain. Some prefer distance and independence. Others experience a mix of both, creating confusion in their reactions. These styles are not random categories. They are reflections of the emotional blueprint that was formed over time. And once these styles are understood, everything becomes even clearer. Because now, instead of just knowing that patterns exist, it becomes possible to identify exactly which pattern is active. It becomes possible to understand why certain reactions happen, why certain relationships feel the way they do, and why certain emotional cycles keep repeating. This is where real insight begins to take shape, because understanding these styles does not just explain the past, it gives direction for the future. It shows what needs attention, what needs balance, and what needs to be reshaped for healthier connection. And as this understanding deepens, the journey becomes more focused. Because now, it is no longer just about asking why love feels a certain way. It is about recognizing the specific style that shapes that experience and learning how it influences every emotional response within a relationship. That is where the next layer begins to unfold.